In the year 2025, a lady's most fashionable accessory is the sword.
I think I got that covered. Medieval-inspired fashion, or medievalcore, has taken the alternative fashion world by storm. At the 2024 VMAs, pop star Chappell Roan donned a medieval sleeved robe and even a full knight's armor. In 2025, she brought the style back with a 15th century hennin. A TikTok of friends making these princess hats amassed almost 2 million views. Handmade chainmail accessories are making a comeback. Pinterest reported a 110% rise in searches for medievalcore at the end of 2024, and the hashtag medievalcore on TikTok has more than 20,000 posts under it. Medieval-inspired outfits and everyday fantasy outfits show viewers how to add a bit of magic to an everyday look. I really love this style, not only because it's so fantasy adjacent, but I also really like seeing women combine hyper femininity like corsets and little princess dresses with masculinity like the knight's armor and the chainmail. Lauren Cochrane writes about this trend for The Guardian. She says there's a sense that young people raised in a digital world might want to regress to a time that feels deeply unmodern. And she thinks that in general fashion has become a means for escapism, but also a way to kind of reinstate subcultures to recognize people that have the same style as you and are therefore similar to you. What has sparked this recent medieval revival and our need to escape back to a world of princesses and knights and swords and chainmail? It may seem like this medieval nostalgia is just shallow escapism in times of political unrest, but in this video we're gonna see the many ways in which medievalcore and fantasy is actually often used in counterculture, and how these escapist fantasies can actually fuel an imagination of a better future. Guys, I'm so excited about this video. We are going to be talking about 60s medieval fashion revival. We're going to talk about like the surprisingly radical roots of the Renaissance fair, and we're even going to be talking about Lord of the Rings. Did you know that Lord of the Rings played a big role in 60s counterculture? You'll see, you'll see. So in order to understand like the modern version of medievalcore, we have to kind of look back to history, to other moments in history where we had a little bit of a medieval revival. Because this is definitely not the first time. Like there were many moments in history where people were like, the Middle Ages, it actually didn't seem so dark. First, let's chat about romanticism. The art style. I love that I just have some of that art lying around. This was a 19th century literary and art movement that kind of offered an alternative to kind of the rationality of Enlightenment art, and there were strong themes of nature, of strong emotions, a focus on the sublime. And in Romanticism, romantic authors often romanticized the Middle Ages for their stories, basically creating a fantasy version of the Middle Ages that was never really there, with a focus on chivalry, social stability, and like the highly emotional stories of knights and princesses. And this nostalgia for a romanticized version of the Middle Ages didn't just come out of nowhere. Like it was a clear response to the Enlightenment era. People were very disillusioned with this big focus on reason and rationality. Greta Van Tol writes for Barnaby's magazine, an important aspect of this development was the many years of war that marked Europe after the French Revolution. The feeling of constant threat and insecurity made people yearn for a nostalgia of better times. And Elizabeth Middleton writes about the medieval revival for varsity. She mentions the pre-Raphaelite art from the 19th century. Got her here. Also often portrayed a very romanticized version of the Middle Ages, especially with like the knights and the princesses kind of overemphasizing this idea of chivalry and romance. It is no coincidence that this medieval revival coincided with the Industrial Revolution. As the world changed around them, artists and craftsmen looked back to what they perceived to be a simpler, more beautiful, and more humane time. So we're basically seeing this love for medievalism, or importantly, like a romanticized version of the Middle Ages. This love for medievalism is often sparked when people are disillusioned with the society at the time, with the political state and the technological advancements of the time. And we see this again in the 60s, which is going to be our main focus for today. There was also a big medieval renaissance in the 60s. So the view of the medieval times in the 60s was jewelry, craftsmanship, communes, a place to imagine and create your own little tight-knit groups. It was basically, this view of the Middle Ages was basically the opposite of what was going on in like the Western world and in America in the 60s. We had the Cold War, the Vietnam War, civil rights movements, the space age and nuclear power and all these kinds of big technological advancements. And Technicolor in home TVs made it so that people were more aware of what was going on everywhere in the world than ever before. Just like in the 19th century, people started to long for a simpler time. And that is prime ground for a new medieval revival. In the 60s, medieval revival meant bell sleeves, embroidered cloaks, velvet. The Beatles donned a very court jestery outfit in their I Am the Walrus video clip. This iconic image of Patty and Jenny Boyd in Vogue magazine in 1964. You can really see, again, this kind of like court jestery outfits, and also you can see the little crenellations of a castle on the bottom of the skirt. Dutch design collective De Fool published a psychedelic folk album in their signature design style, which was inspired by the tarot card The Fool, invoking again a very medieval court jestery outfit with colorful tights and bell sleeves. You can also see these band members rocking capes and embroidered velvet pieces. Another psychedelic folk trio, Sunforest, also used this medieval inspired sleeves and the flower crowns. These cloaks, sleeves and velvet became a staple of hippie fashion, giving it a bit of a more whimsical and magical flair, and thereby kind of rejecting modern life. But although this fashion was medieval inspired, it is still very distinctly 60s with its mini skirts and the bright colors that were very distinct of the mod fashion style of the time. It wasn't historically accurate, but that was never the point. It was more a fantasy version of the medieval times. But it wasn't just the fashion in the 60s that was medieval inspired. We had Ren fairs becoming a thing where people dressed up in vaguely historic outfit and did some jousting and court gesturing and eating turkey legs. We're going to talk about that more later. The legend of King Arthur was a very common inspiration for films, like The Sword and the Stone from Disney and 1960s Camelot, among others. So what was the point of all this escaping into this psychedelic fever dream of medieval nights? Like I already mentioned, the 60s was a time of political unrest. The Vietnam War, civil rights movement, nuclear power becoming a thing. I think Olivia Welsh summarized it really well in her piece on medieval revival of the 60s and 70s. She says, "Many looked back, not to regress, but to reimagine alternative ways of living. The medieval period, with its rich symbolism, artisan culture, and perceived closeness to nature, provided a stark contrast to modern industrial life and political disillusionment." So actually very similar to why people in the Romantic art movements looked back to the Middle Ages. And I think the key word here is imagine, you know? Imagine all the people. But was that from the 60s? I don't even know. The inspiration didn't come from actual historical sources, but from things that blended the Middle Ages with fantasy, like the Renaissance fairs and the King Arthur legends. The 60s and 70s didn't just revive the medieval, they reinvented it. In doing so, they created a space where myth, rebellion, and imagination merged. A space where the past became a canvas for dreaming of a better world. Is this medieval fantasy just an escape, like a looking away? Or are there ways in which fantasy can actually be used to resist and to imagine a better future? Well, one example of using history and fantasy to imagine a better future is actually the origin of the Renaissance fairs. I really didn't know about this So I'm really excited to share this with you. If you don't know what a Renaissance fair is, first of all, if you're in my audience, you should go to a Renaissance fair. I think you would like that. I love going to a Renaissance fair, or at least Renaissance fair are a pretty American thing, I think, but I really like, I live in the Netherlands, so I go to, I don't think they're called Renaissance fairs, but they're more like fantasy fairs. Are kind of similar, but they're a little bit more fantasy focused instead of historical focused, but we'll get to that. A Renaissance fair is a place where people dress up in kind of historical outfits, knights, princesses, but nowadays also like elves or hobbits or just general fantasy-ish, medieval-ish characters. You will see people wearing corsets, carrying bow and arrows, eating turkey legs, doing jousting competitions. There are swords, there are pirates. It's people living in this fantasy world, a historical fantasy world. But where did this Renaissance fair actually start? It started in 1963 in California. It was called a Renaissance Pleasure Fair, and the first one was organized by Phyllis and Ron Patterson. Phyllis Patterson was a history, English, speech, and drama teacher, just all-around teacher. She was looking for ways to make theater education more interactive for children. Kelly Faircloth writes for National Geographic. The educator got the idea for the Ren Fair while running an after-school program teaching kids about theater history. Her students particularly loved commedia dell'arte, a form of outdoor popular entertainment from the Italian Renaissance. And Phyllis got inspired specifically by the idea of a medieval pageant wagon. And she built one so she could do theater on this medieval pageant wagon and dress up in character. This was so popular with the kids that she came up with a new idea to reuse this wagon, but in a bigger way. And that was by recreating a Elizabethan country fair. And this country fair became the first Ren Fair with its props and decor and costuming. The entire fair was built by volunteers, right? They had to build stages, they had to build booths from scrap wood that they could find. The Ren Fair was held at a summer camp location that was owned by a social organizer, so this first Ren Fair was truly a community event. Not only that, the whole point of the Ren Fair was to be a 2-day fundraiser for a local radio station, the KPFK Pacifica Radio, which was a listener-sponsored radio in California. Now, it's important to understand the political context of the 60s. So the 60s in America was the era of McCarthyism and the Red Scare, where any left-leaning person was very quickly labeled and put aside as a communist. If you wanted to teach in California, you had to sign a non-communist oath, like a loyalty oath. And there was a small group of Californian teachers that refused to sign this oath because they thought that it went against freedom of speech. Phyllis Patterson, who was an educator, left traditional education in the 1960s because she refused to sign this oath. She believed that it was unconstitutional. And the Ren Fair was her way to still do education in a more independent way. And I said that a lot of the people at this Ren Fair were volunteers. This is because there were so many educators and actors and craftsmen that were out of work because of their left-leaning positions. This really established the Ren Fair as countercultural at heart. So these volunteers helped to build the beautiful banners, the decor, the costumes for the actors, everything so that the visitors could truly feel like they walked into history, into a different world, escaping modern life. There were multiple stages at this fair with dancing, magic, miming, juggling, flame eating. Love that. Renaissance music, body ballads, lute and recorder performances, and scenes from William Shakespeare's plays. People came dressed in home-sewn costumes that they made themselves. And they brought all sorts of home-crafted items like pottery, jewelry, glassmaking, leatherwork, wood cutting. So the Renaissance Pleasure Fair wasn't just a way to do accurate historical education. It also wasn't just for pleasure and revelry. It really was a way to imagine a different way of living. It was fantasy in the form of radical imagination. The Renaissance pleasure fair was such a success that they kept doing it in the next years. And in the years after that, the historical accuracy became more important for the Pattersons. So they really tried to only use tools and technology from the Elizabethan time. But because of the popularity of this Ren Fair, different Ren Fairs started springing up all over America, some of them with just less of a focus on the historical accuracy. But in all of these Ren Fairs, there was so much space for small businesses that would do craft work, glass blowing, pottery, etc., costume making. And because of this big focus on the costume, these Ren Fairs also started to attract a lot of cosplayers and LARPers and other fantasy fans, slowly kind of mingling this historical and fantasy aspect. Which I think makes sense because a lot of kind of classic Western epic fantasy has a medieval or Renaissance setting. I'm thinking of Lord of the Rings, I'm thinking of Game of Thrones. Also, if I think of the Ren Fairs that I like to go to, some of them are super fantasy focused, others are more historically accurate focused, others are a little bit more like spiritual or pagan. There is so many different ways nowadays that these Ren Fairs or fantasy fairs are executed. But the core is still that it is about a fantasy of a different time, escaping into a non-modern world. And they are still a pretty countercultural space, mostly attracting more alternative people or more progressive people.
This, by the way, is something I still notice even in modern fantasy fairs, at least the ones that I tend to go to, is on these fantasy fairs I see way more, for example, people in wheelchairs or people who have disabilities than at other types of events. I really know that these fairs really try to make sure that the event grounds are accessible for example, wheelchairs, and that these spaces are inclusive to people who are otherwise excluded from other spaces.
The Patterson family tells National Geographic there are fewer and fewer things that we're able to dedicate ourselves to that are not involving a screen. And in that way, the Ren Fair is still a way of escaping modern life. Another example of fantasy being used in counterculture is actually Lord of the Rings. So the Lord of the Rings trilogy was published in the 50s, but it became extremely popular on college campuses in the 60s. Cheap paperbacks caused a skyrocketing of sales. Students would try to learn the Elvish language, they would draw their own maps, they would print fan magazines. And the 60s was also a time of unrest in America. Especially college campuses were a hub for anti-Vietnam War protests. So it's not surprising that Tolkien's popularity at these college campuses became inextricably linked with the anti-war protests. Kathy Spencer writes in the anti-war adoption of Lord of the Rings, Go-Go Gandalf, Frodo lives, and Smeagol died for your sins were worn on t-shirts and pins and graffitied onto subway walls. So why did Lord of the Rings lend itself so well for political protest? Jane Chiabatti writes for BBC, Middle-earth was a literary escape hatch for a generation haunted by the Vietnam War and the atomic bomb, a return to simpler living. Yet again, in times of political unrest, people just want to go back to what they perceive as a simpler time. Very similar to medievalism. If you think of Lord of the Rings, it kind of has the same vibe. It has like a vaguely medieval Renaissance setting. Especially the hobbits have this simple lifestyle. It's very communal. They're just eating a bunch of dinner with each other and have parties and frolic around in corsets and long skirts. But on top of that, Middle-earth wasn't just an escape to a world of cute hobbits and elegant elves. For many, Middle-earth felt eerily similar to America. Mordor was an industrial hellscape, perhaps staffed by the same sort of men drafting teenagers into Vietnam. The Ring, a corrupting force of pure power, became a stand-in for nuclear weapons, for imperialism, for the creeping fingers of the draft board. Writes Siddhara Ranasinghe on her Substack. So on the one hand, Lord of the Rings could be this cute escape like the Middle Ages, but It also kind of sparked imagination. A lot of people found themselves in this story of good versus evil. In Lord of the Rings, war is very much depicted as something that is only necessary for good to overcome evil, right? The war against Sauron happens in self-defense to the war that Sauron is waging on Middle-earth. The ring must be destroyed to destroy evil once and for all. America's involvement in the Vietnam War, on the other hand, was widely protested because it was seen as completely unnecessary. American readers questioned America's intentions in its involvement in Vietnam. The United States was not attacked, and Vietnam did not seek to harm in any way. In the hippies' view, rather than responding to injustice as Gondor does, America was causing it. In many ways, Lord of the Rings is pretty anti-violence, and war is only used as a very last resort. Here are some examples of this that Spencer mentioned. In The Hobbit, the men and the dwarves always first try to parley before they start fighting. The Fellowship often attempts to forgive those that have worked with Sauron, like Wormtongue and Saruman. Bilbo sacrifices his respected status with Thorin to bring about peace for all. But the Vietnam War was not the only time that Lord of the Rings imagery was used as protest. During the Bush administration, protesters of the War on Terror would say, "Frodo has failed, Bush has the ring," invoking an image of Bush as an evil Sauron-like authority. Doyle Irvin writes for American Forests about how the Lord of the Rings books also present a view of nature that at the time was pretty foreign still in Western countries, with lines such as "the trees and the grasses and all things growing or living in the land belong each to themselves," conveying this idea of nature as something that deserves to be respected in itself. Because of this, you can see Lord of the Rings imagery being used in environmental activism. For example, there is this advertisement from Greenpeace that uses Lord of the Rings imagery in this campaign, where the fossil fuel industries are depicted as orcs and monsters from Mordor. And I think this all makes a lot of sense. Like, Lord of the Rings isn't just an escapist fantasy. It is very specifically a story about standing up against evil and taking responsibility. Frodo is specifically just some regular dude. He doesn't believe that he is special, and he is not special. But the story is very much about him taking the responsibility to bear the ring and take down the reign of Sauron. It's a hero's journey that is very activating. Perfect for activism. Like I said before, I think the setting of Lord of the Rings is very romanticized Middle Ages adjacent. It fits the romantic view that people had of the Middle Ages, with this communal living, elaborate dinners, second breakfast. We can see some modern examples of like medievalism and Lord of the Rings-esque fantasy blending. In this TikTok that I showed earlier of this woman showing her handmade chainmail headpiece tagged medievalcore, gets a lot of comments of people saying that she reminds them of Arwen from Lord of the Rings. There's this trend online of hobbitcore and cozy fantasy books that is all about escaping hustle culture and embracing a slower lifestyle with afternoon teas. So as we've seen, in the past, medievalism and historical fantasy became popular in times of disillusionment with the current political state. To me, the modern rise of medievalcore, let's say like the 2020s version of medievalcore, reads like a refusal of everything that is modern and mainstream. To me, it is like the opposite of the mainstream beauty style for women, which is more adjacent to kind of minimal clean girl look, whereas medievalcore is super over the top, very maximalist, and like I said, it's blending femininity with masculinity. And if we look at the current cultural context, we are also going through a time of political unrest and technological change. There's fascism on the rise all over Europe and in the United States. There's an AI tech revolution that is shaking up every industry and making us question our own humanity. It is prime time to revert back to medieval fantasy escapism and craft cute little princess hats with your friends. But I think it's too easy to say that it's all just escapism. Yes, all these examples of medievalism that we've seen were fueled by a need to escape to a simpler time. But that escapist fantasy has also led to protesting, to 60s counterculture, to fundraising at a Renaissance fair. This shows that escapism can allow people to imagine a different reality, a different future. We can never change our current political situation without imagining what we would want instead. These fantasies give us the ability to think, how could we do this differently? Maybe other ways of living are possible. And I think there's already so many examples of fantasy books that use the fantasy genre to either imagine a different future or critique our modern societies. Like, some of my favorites are, of course, the Broken Earth trilogy, which is an epic escapist fantasy, but it also heavily critiques discrimination and is a huge metaphor for how we exploit Mother Earth, so to say. Books like Blood Over Brighthaven and Babel use fantasy to critique colonialism. T.J. Klune's books are full of anti-bureaucracy messages. And I think this whole trend of cozy fantasy that came up during the pandemic when people were in need of kind of like a cozy escape is still very popular because people want to have this cozy escape of books that are just about like orcs making coffee or demons having a cute little romance without like big bad evil guys. You know, grimdark fantasy that was popular 10 years ago just doesn't really cut it anymore because people want to escape the grimdark reality that is our lives right now. I think the most clear modern example of how we use fantasy in counterculture and resistance. This is literally the entire reason that sparked the idea of this video, and I'm only now mentioning it as like a little add-on at the end, but it's the use of the hanging tree from the Hunger Games movies in political TikToks. If you don't know, the hanging tree is a song from the Hunger Games movies that is used by the resistance. People that are fighting in the revolution often sing this song called The Hanging Tree. This is very often used as a TikTok sound underneath political videos. For example, videos of celebrities living extravagant, opulent lives opposed to footage of war zones or environmental destruction. The Hunger Games is a story about revolution and the giant class differences that exist in the Hunger Games world. And now this song is often used in real life, in real TikToks, to show real big class differences between opulent elites and people that are struggling. And I think this is such a good example. I would almost go as far as to say that this is like the 2020s version of people in the 60s saying Frodo lives and go Gandalf. The Hunger Games, which yes, is a very fun and escapist young adult fiction book and movie trilogy, but can clearly also be used to convey a message, convey our opinions about our current modern world. I think Sadara Ranasinghe puts it the most beautifully when she says, "When reality feels unbearable, fantasy becomes both sanctuary and sword." So next time someone tells you that fantasy books are just shallow escapism and don't say anything interesting about the world around us, you now know what to say. You have a wealth of examples to prove them wrong.
Leonie from the future hopping in. So I was looking for these TikToks with the hanging tree sound that I was talking about, and while trying to search for these TikToks, I found out that I am, of course, very much in a bubble on social media. Like, for example, I mostly get the videos that I was talking about with the hanging tree sounds about climate change or pro-Palestine videos, but I found that this sound, this hanging tree sound, is used for a wide variety on things. On Instagram, I found examples of this sound being used for extremely Islamophobic content. I've seen it used for like alpha male be a man content. Crazy. And also just for straight up conspiracy theories. To me, this is a kind of odd. I didn't expect this because the Hunger Games has always been a story about, yes, revolution against an authoritarian government, but very specifically also a story that is against worker exploitation. It's a story that is against hyper-consumerism. But I guess that, yeah, in the end, the bare bones story of the Hunger Games is just, you know, a revolution against a big bad evil government. And that is something that I think anyone can project their own opinions onto, which I think explains why this song is actually used across the political spectrum. And also, of course, it was a trending Instagram audio for a while, which will also make people use it just because they hope it will boost their video. And I actually found similar things for Lord of the Rings. Like in this video, I focused a lot on how Lord of the Rings was used in anti-war movements and in the environmental movement. But I also found examples of Lord of the Rings and Lord of the Rings imagery being used on very different sides of the political spectrum. Examples. In 1977 Italy, Lord of the Rings apparently became very popular among neo-fascist youth groups that rejected modernity and wanted to build a new society, which in their case meant with complete cultural homogeneity, of course. They started a summer camp called Camp Hobbit with the goal of creating like a new right movement. In October 2025, the Department of Homeland Security in the USA posted an encouragement to join ICE, who are currently doing like mass arresting of immigrants in the US, and they used a quote from Lord of the Rings saying, "There won't be a Shire anymore, Pippin," implying that getting rid of the immigrants is keeping the homeland, the Shire, from being destroyed, basically implying that immigrants are destroying the US using Lord of the Rings imagery. I've also noticed that a lot of tech startups love using Lord of the Rings words. Most famously, we have, of course, Palantir, the data software company that was founded by Peter Thiel, which was named after the scrying orb from Lord of the Rings. And Palantir has been allegedly involved in government surveillance, enabling deportations under the Trump administration, passing on healthcare data to ICE. They have allegedly been involved in Cambridge Analytica, and that is just like a few of their controversies. Just like with the Hunger Games, Lord of the Rings in its most bare bones is just a story of like a normal guy against big bad evil. So anyone can project their own story, their own opinions onto that. And I think that is why we see Lord of the Rings being used for so many things.
I loved researching this video. I think this is one of my favorite video essays that I've ever researched, so I really hope you enjoyed this one. And I would love to know if you know any more examples of fantasy stories or like medieval stories being used in like a countercultural way. What do you think of the medievalcore trend? Do you think it's here to stay, or do you think it's just like another little micro trend that we're gonna forget about next year? I want to see it in 2026. So yeah, I really hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you soon in another video very soon. Goodbye.